So anyway, Flack, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? I'm 25. I'm just curious kind of a little bit about the ACP because I've heard a bit about you guys, but I've heard some mixed things. I'm a communist myself.
Hmm.
And I always like to have some friendly hearted, left discussion. Like they might be able to get into some stuff. I want to pull up y'all's program real quick because I had some questions
Jacob,
about that.
I accepted you, but then you disconnected, so you have to go next. I don't know what to tell you. Go ahead.
Yeah, like I was saying, I got some questions about your program and just, if you could tell me a bit about your party and why you think someone should be involved with it.
Let's drop a 10, y'all. Um, I would say if you're a communist with a capital C, unapologetically, meaning you're not doing these cope detours, if you're like actually a communist with a capital C, you're not like saying, oh, I'm a communist, but Stalin was bad. You're like actually a communist. I would say there's just no other alternative to us, for better or for worse. And that, if you think we're doing something wrong, you could do it better. You could make your case to us. We're pretty open. We're pretty flexible. We don't really have like gatekeepers who are preventing work from being done like other parties do. We're not ruled by boomers or Gen X people or millennials even. We're ruled youth-led. And it's a pretty open door, pretty blank canvas in a lot of ways for how do we move forward as a we're learning from experience most of all.
Yeah.
But I just don't think there's an alternative to us. I mean, if it's not us, who else,
That's fair. I mean, we're in a very interesting era on the left in this country. I mean, the left hardly exists, to be honest. Like you'd probably
Yeah.
agree that the DSA is hard to even call left at all. They're just
Right.
supporting the Democrats. Same thing
Exactly.
with CPUSA. So we're seeing all this pressure for people to join a communist movement, and people are looking for something serious out there. And you seem pretty serious about this. But I'm curious what you said, like capital C communist, meaning that like you said something about Stalin there, and then also I got a question about point 17 on your program, promotion of American civilization. I'm not really sure exactly what you guys mean by that.
Yeah, we just think that we don't really have a clearly defined American nation, And hold on one sec. Carlos, what's up? Appreciate you, bro. Yeah, we don't really have a clearly defined national existence as Americans. And we want to kind of discover a unique civilization on this land by this people. All the people here, right? And we're very open to what that potentially could or has to look like. And we just think we should stop emulating Europe and looking to Europe for guidance on how we should be. And we should kind of embrace our geography, right?
Okay, interesting. I'm still not really exactly sure what you mean by that, but if I had to guess, like, would it mean like you could have like a multi-country, like racial, ethnic background kind of American culture?
Well,
Because when I think of America, I think of
we
sorry?
want one American civilization that is a fusion of all those things. I would say like this, like China promotes Chinese civilization, Confucius and the classics and stuff. We want to do that, we just don't have it. So we need to also simultaneously build it.
Okay, well, I see where you're coming from with that. Yeah, there's definitely different ideas, and I think part of society and being able to move forward in a positive way is having a unified national myth or international myth, like kind of
I wouldn't say it's a myth. I wouldn't say it's a myth.
maybe not a myth. Actually, yeah, you're right about that. Like a collective understanding of who we are and what we're fighting for.
Yeah.
And right now in the U.S., it like you said, it is
Yeah.
it is a myth really in this country now, and it's all over the place. It's not consistent, and I think that gives a level of disorientation to people today.
Yeah.
So, what was your position on the Soviet Union? Would you say you're more of a hardline supporter of them, or like critical support? I would say critical support is definitely what I think of them. But
Well,
I'm curious
you
what
have
the
to be
ACP thinks because that's really important.
critical of everything, but to an extent uncritical, like unconditional. Like, okay, if Brezhnev was around and things popped off between Brezhnev and the imperialist bloc. I understand he's a revisionist. I understand what de-Stalinization was totally unjustified. But if that conflict happened, am I going to be critical? I mean, no. I'm going to tie me to a missile and send me to NATO.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel it the same way. So, like, for example, I really like following a lot of Trotsky's lines on this. I think he's got a pretty good analysis on the Soviet Union. But if I was there when the Great Patriotic War started, like, you bet that I'd be out there on the front lines just as much as anyone else, right? At the end of the day,
but I just I can't agree with the Trotskyite thing. I'm sorry. It's like mentioning the shaitan and expecting me not to react. Just casually dropping shaitan right there. You can't just be casually dropping shaitan and expect me to be chill with it. I'm sorry, It's like Trotsky. I mean, like, you just randomly dropping shaitan in here. And can't have that. It's like casually referencing the mustache painter man. Anyway, where's the other guy who wanted to... Where's that guy who requested? Who said that he... ACP is unserious. What does it mean to be serious today, Think about that. I feel like the only thing that means serious just means action. It doesn't mean like I'm going to act a certain way on TikTok. Yeah. No, it's just stupid. Like, oh, you're serious because of how you act on TikTok. I just kind of feel like that's nonsense. The only thing that determines your seriousness is your commitment. It's not how you act on social media that determines your seriousness. It's what are your commitments? What do you actually do? Can't tolerate discussion because you can't compete with Trotsky's ideas. I don't need to compete with ideas that have no basis or foundation. I mean, there's nothing to correct for. It's a dead end. We know what Trotsky looks like in real life. We know what Trotskyism looks like. It's a dead end. I see no opening. I see nothing to debate about. Why be a Trotsky? The burden is on... Okay, you can request again, but I'm putting the burden on you. Why should I be a Trotskyist? Why should I accept Trotsky's ideas? I have to put the burden on you. All right.
Yo, big respect for letting me back up here. Well, I think the main thing is socialism, one country versus permanent revolution.
But you know how it's a logical fallacy or contradiction?
Well, everything's contradictory. What do you mean?
Yeah, but I mean it in the sense it's like a self-negating, self-undermining notion of permanent revolution. Okay. And it's in the etymology. Okay. Well, let's start here. What's a revolution?
The transformation of society.
Yeah, but what's a revolution?
Wouldn't you say that is what it is?
I could work with that, but I think it's so much more simple. What is etymologically, like, what's the actual definition of a revolution?
Oh, like well, I mean, it goes back to dialectics, right? It's one of these brief periods of significant upheaval of something, a transformation from one thing to something else, something mutually exclusive before and after, something like that.
It's way more. It's actually way more. There's like a root meaningfulness of that word that is so much simpler, to the point where it doesn't only have to be applied to historical phenomena.
What are you getting at?
Do cars have revolutions?
Yeah.
Right. So do you know what a revolution is?
A rotation?
Yeah. Exactly.
Sure.
Like a cycle. That's a revolution. How could that be permanent?
The permanent revolution is a permanent circling of progress in this spiral that moves forward. It's like a double helix moving forward, this constant rotation.
Okay. I could work with that. But here's the problem. the problem is, you said progress, the permanent revolution of progress. Progress always has to acquire a qualitative determination. I agree that the development of nature and history is unceasing, never ends. But the specific transformations do end. The transformation of one thing into another thing is the movement of one determination to another determination. The transformation as such cannot last forever. Now, transformation in the abstract is eternal in this sense. But when we're speaking about the particulars, you're talking about the transformation of one thing into another. When you're speaking about revolutions, you're talking about a specific revolution, which of course must end and cannot be permanent. Does that mean the process of change ends forever? No. But how can we speak of change? And this is how Trotsky doesn't understand dialectics. How can we talk about change without determinations? If everything is just flux and everything is just change, we lose the point of reference to the things that are changing in the first place. What is changing and what does it change into? So there's a distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative. There's a distinction between content and the form. Trotsky thought he could achieve the eternity of a content that doesn't have to go through form. That's the problem. Content eventually has to acquire form. In order to further partake in content, by the way, if you remain suspended in the pretense of content that suppresses form, ones of you can still hear me in the green place.
I can still hear you.
I believe you. Okay, you can still. All right. He's suppressing the formal consequences of the content of revolution. But that doesn't mean you will avoid those consequences. It means that you will be trapped within the formal framework that is pre-revolutionary. And that's why sociologically and demographically, you will never be able to convince me, short of changing everything I've ever seen and read from history, Trotskyism and left communism were both sociologically part of the same historical strata as fascism. Both of them were reacting to a qualitative revolutionary change that happens sometime after 1929, 1930, that created a new type of political subject and civilizational subject. A mass subject, mass politics, popular... People associate Nazism and fascism with mass politics, but they were actually a reaction to mass politics. They were a defense of classical liberal individualism in the face of, true, organic, material mass politics. They emulated the aesthetics of mass politics in many respects, but fascism, it's the fascists. It's the kind of individuals uniting together and binding together in a pact to defend their private property against the masses. That's basically what it was. And Trotskyism is part of that reaction because the mass subject in the USSR was the peasantry. And Trotsky was defending the sanctity and integrity of the classical, modern, European individual subject versus this popular subject that was the basis of Stalin's cult of personality.
Could you clarify what you mean by that a little bit more? I haven't heard a notion like that before.
Yeah, so Russia obviously was
maybe like a concrete example. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. Okay, a concrete example was that in the 1920s, during the debates following Lenin's death, Stalin's support was based primarily in newer cadre that were joining the party, who were very much coming from the countryside in many cases, from the Soviets.
I agree on this. Like they were used to this WAR communism where there was little questioning of the status quo and authority. These newer cadre and also
Exactly.
this significant base in the peasant class who were more conservative,
And Trotsky
and
believed,
also a
yeah,
lot of support amongst the bureaucracy, which was, like Lenin said, the czarist state anointed with socialist oil.
yeah, sure, but ultimately, all of these forces Trotsky regarded as having contaminated. In the fight against bureaucracy, Stalin did not stop that fight. And Lenin acquiesced to the reality that we're faced with this czarist imperial machine that we have not fully replaced. Lenin also had to acquiesce to it. So the fight against bureaucracy, I don't think it acquires any concrete development in the Trotskyist tradition. Only in the Marxist-Leninist tradition do we finally have something like Mao's Cultural Revolution, where that ability to deal with the impersonal, bureaucratic nature of state machines is possible in the first place. It's a different contradiction. But in any case, I would focus here more on the mass subject of Russian politics and civilization, which was coming from the peasantry. Trotsky very much believed that the revolution and its sacred principles would be completely destroyed if it embeds itself and defines itself within that context, because he didn't regard Russia as advanced enough, right? Because Western Europe has the proletariat and Russia does not. And so we need to be, our state has to be ruled by the true proletariat, the true subject, right? And, but in practice, this was civilizational racism. In practice, I mean, that's the form it took. The less developed races, the Chinese, the Russians, others, they have no basis with which to lead. So they have to follow the civilization of Western Europe. And Lenin said that we should pursue a different path for the construction of civilization, a non-European path. That's what he said. And I think the last thing he wrote, actually, one of the last things. But anyway, I think that Trotsky represented the vanity and the overextension of a very specific type of classical liberal Western subject faced with the reality of mass politics and reacting against it. And I would put Mussolini and Hitler in the same camp. So, because the proletarian politics he was talking about was mythical, never actually existed. For a brief period, it seemed like it existed in the October Revolution, but the city proletariat were turned out to be only part-time proletarians. They had land in the countryside that they went back to during the Civil War. And meanwhile, in Western Europe, the mythical proletariat was not at all a revolutionary subject. In fact, it was a profoundly conservative and petty bourgeois subject.
In Western Europe?
Yeah.
What? I mean, do you see the waves of revolutions in Western Europe after 1917? I mean, 1918 in Germany.
Those revolutions were simply a temporary vacuum that was filled due to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires. So they never represented a positive principle of proletarian politics asserting itself. They were simply the negative consequences of the dissolution of the losing side of World War I, which were the imperial confederations and states that lost. Some people tried to hijack that, and in Hungary and in Germany, but it was a total failure.
Well, yes, they had a lack of working class leadership, for sure. A shortage of a quality party to move them forward.
And the reason they didn't have the party is because they never had a mass subject. They were focused on trying to solely and exclusively base themselves in the traditional social democratic concept of the proletariat, which had, by that time, become institutionalized and no longer revolutionary.
I'm not sure what you mean by the proletariat becoming, like you said, the proletariat becoming institutionalized?
Yeah, through trade unions, through social democracy itself becoming an appendage of the state, and through the growth and rise of imperialism, which very much, compartmentalized and institutionalized labor, and very much institutionalized things that before were much wilder. I mean, Engels and Marx talked about this tendency with respect to the English proletariat.
Okay, for example, like basically because the proletariat in these more advanced countries has received essentially bribes, kind of like what Lenin talked in the imperialist core
No,
countries,
not
that
necessarily bribes. It's just the way that they became a new type of subject, right? They became a subject of institutions. Um, a vacuum of leadership had been filled by petty bourgeois leadership that was allied to the state, the imperialist state, and they were no longer an inherently revolutionary subject.
so you're saying the class became unrevolutionary, or would you say I would say that they were just limited by
I think
leadership that
I
was
would say
misguiding them.
that Dimitrov and the Popular Front thesis was the good place to start. That it's not that they were they had no revolutionary potential. It's that there was a need to embed party politics in a much broader stratum of the people than just the traditional factory proletariat. So in the case of England, Marx and Engels talked about the Irish. In the case of Central and Eastern Europe, there was a huge peasantry and farmer class that communists had very much neglected. In the American context, William Foster came from a farmer worker background of farmer worker organizing. And that's why he, was able to kind of grow the Communist Party to this extent that it was. But focusing solely on the urban proletariat was impossible. In order to undermine imperialism, it would have been necessary to establish a counter-hegemonic foundation in the mass subject.
A mass subject other than the proletariat? I mean, I agree. It's not just the industrial proletariat.
Look, the truth is, the majority of the people in most countries cannot be defined on the basis of one class. They oscillate and they have vacillating tendencies, and they are compelled by different class principles and tendencies. And usually this is a middle subject, who usually is called the peasantry. In Russia, actually, peasantry just meant subsistence farmer and nothing else. But this subject is almost always the majority. I mean, the factory proletariat being the majority is a crisis that will immediately mean revolution. That's why it's usually very rare for that to be the case.
What about the proletariat outside of the factories? Would you say they have a fundamentally different character to them?
Okay, so Marx was describing proletarianization, people being separated from their means of production and they have nothing to sell but their labor. That's broadly the proletariat in Marx's time, not just factory proletarians, right?
Right.
But by the time that process becomes so comprehensive that the alienation from the traditional means of production is completed. So in America, when people are being kicked out of their farms and all these different divisions of labor that were not yet proletarianized became proletarianized, the intensity of proletarianization was symmetrical to the institutionalization and the rise of welfare states and the rise of kind of social policies and a social orientation of the imperialist state that very much created a new social contract and almost a new type of property, subsistence property, that was based in a social contract with the state, where you no longer have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a citizenship that is a guarantee of a certain way of life and a certain minimal condition of a standard of living that gives you the same level of stability that a farmer used to have. And so the destabilizing proletarianizing process becomes a process of mass institutionalization by modern states and societies, which is even more stable than pre-modern and feudal society in many ways. So it was paradoxical, and it's something Marxists didn't anticipate at all. They thought that proletarianization would lead to people just having nothing but their labor to sell, and therefore disposed to revolutionary, social instability would collapse, the superstructure, and revolution would be inevitable. It was partially true, but the way that happened was not anticipated. A new type of subject emerged, that a post-liberal, post-individual, post-capitalist mass subject whose rights, classical political rights, were also combined with certain economic rights, objectively, right? And that more or less offset the destabilizing consequences of proletarianization. It's like, think about it this way, instead of being a guy who has nothing to sell but their labor, you're now an employee of an institution of control and command of society. Most people aren't directly government employees, but they're employees of hegemonic institutions. And this is, you're no longer just selling your labor anymore.
What do you mean by that?
You're participating in a more broader kind of social contract where you are given certain guarantees of a certain way of life, of a certain standard of living. You have expectations that are indeed fulfilled, and that becomes the basis and foundation of the stability of the state.
Yeah, it's basically like what Lenin was writing about in imperialism, where the super profits that are used from exploiting okay.
No, that was
I didn't really get to finish my point, but
that was a distinct tendency. These super profits that were being used to that was, yes, the institutionalization of a new labor bureaucracy and aristocracy was only the beginning. What Lenin didn't anticipate is how this basically would become universalized. And the financial revenues that were a product of imperialism, or in the post-war period, super-imperialism, in any case, people are no longer living solely on the basis of their labor, but from steady streams of revenue that are very much financialized. And the extent, this is where a theory of class struggle today would be relevant, is who actually depends upon the surpluses that are solely a consequence of imperialism versus who depends upon the actual material wealth produced by labor, by an industrial civilization. So that was the basis of the whole barista debate, by the way, which we got in trouble for. People thought that we claimed baristas are unproductive because we think that they're less masculine, and that's not true. It's just because we're trying to figure out, in an era where imperialist revenues as the basis of people's way of life is universalized, meaning every class is not paid directly because of the sale of their labor. They're more or less paid because of a indiscriminate revenue. So within that revenue, you have to distinguish what is actually a consequence of the material wealth produced by labor, and what is a consequence of revenues, monopoly revenues, of speculative and finance and so on and so on.
Okay, so you're saying that I'm trying to pick up on what you're saying exactly, because I haven't really heard exactly this before. It's not this idea that working class people in like the West are counter-revolutionary or like unrevolutionary.
It's not it at all, yeah.
Sorry. But it's also not, so it's like this idea that you have steady incomes because of the stability of imperialism through things like state benefits, for example, and you're guaranteed a relative stability of life from the system.
And also, it's not only state benefits. Like, look at Trump freaking out about the Strait of Hormuz. The state proactively tries to ensure that there's going to be a minimal standard of living that's fulfilled within the population for political purposes. And
yeah, that's true, right? Yeah. But the thing is, I think that the crisis of capitalism doesn't stop that from changing. Like, we've seen the slowest recovery ever since 2008, for example.
I agree to an extent. But I think that 2008 can simply last much. It's not going to culminate in a Marxian crisis because capitalism, as we know it, is basically functionally dead. It's not. It doesn't have to be ruled by the laws of capitalism anymore.
What?
Yeah, it's a pretty unsustainable. Yes, I agree, but it's a command of the productive forces, but via some type of political fiat now.
Are you saying like the laws of capital, or like the notions that Marx put forward, have changed, or like I agree with a
No,
new
no,
economic
those
system,
were
a different financial
precisely
system?
those precisely didn't change. What changed is history. We are in $40 trillion in debt, and yet the steamboat is still tugging. Okay, so think about what that means.
Well, I think we've seen a lot of examples of states in the past, capitalist states, bourgeois states, that are able to keep trucking along with huge amounts of debt, even historically, right?
No,
We saw
not really.
no, it's unstable.
It's almost. I mean, no. This has been happening. Keep in mind, this is almost a century now.
So
So this is
just to
very
jump
different.
in, you're saying that in the past they haven't been able to move along with significant amounts of debt, but now you're
Not a
saying that they may
not
be able
not in a
to.
century where they're just printing money out of nothing and just keeping the system moving because of aircraft carriers and no.
Well, they
This
do
is
have a strange level of control now, but this, like quantitative easing, for example, this money printing policy can't go on forever. They're going to hit a very hard limit. There's going to
why
be a
though.
tipping point. Hmm?
Why can't it be forever though?
Because eventually the U.S. will have to pay its debts, and
Why?
eventually people are going to realize the U.S. is not a very good debt payer. People are going to stop trusting the U.S. government to actually pay debts. Why would someone take out a
No, no. The
bond?
the debt never has to be paid. Um, a lot of the debt is you need to understand how the system works. As long as part of the debt is continually serviced, everything's fine. Look, put it this way. I'm going to explain how we're paying back the debt. So
Well,
if you're
I'll,
a Japanese businessman, you're buying U.S. government bonds. You actually are getting paid back.
true.
But when we're paying that back, we're printing money to pay you back. So you're getting it back, don't worry. But then the balance sheet on our end is that we just printed money we didn't pay for. So we're basically like in debt to ourselves. Okay? And the guy in Japan doesn't care about that. He doesn't care if we're in debt to ourselves.
Well, wouldn't the Japanese guy care if we're so indebted to ourselves that we're having to cut social services to
No.
just afford to pay the debt? No.
No, he doesn't care.
So you don't think there's any limit to the U.S. debt spending?
The only limits are political. The only limits are based in the logic of civilization itself. Like, how much more will the people tolerate psychologically and politically? Yes, I think those are explosive factors. But
Okay,
by
I
way
agree.
of the economic system itself, is there going to be a Marxist breakdown? No, that happened in 1929, and that's when it actually happened. The one Marx predicted did happen. But something else has, emerged out after that made economics less directly, capitalist crisis no longer directly corresponded to an immediate crisis of politics.
I see where you're coming from. So I got 2 points, if you could let me finish. The first one is that I agree that right now, unless there's a significant transformation in the activity or the consciousness of of
Lennon Dubois,
workers
what's
in
up?
America, sorry,
Don't worry about that.
unless
I'm somewhere else.
no, you're cool. Unless there's a significant change in consciousness or a huge movement of the workers, they will keep on going up with this, right?
Mhm.
The state can get away with doing almost anything it needs to without the conscious intervention of working people. Sorry about the traffic. Philly's crazy. Um, but at the same time, there are absolutely limits, and they will be hit. And I'm curious what you mean by 1929 being a Marxian crash and the potential for one not like
When I
that
say
ever
Marxian,
happening
I just
again.
mean the one like Marx directly predicted would happen based on what he wrote in Capital.
Okay. So I'm not. Can we bring this on back to permanent revolution and socialism in one country? Because
Yeah,
I still,
revolutions cannot be permanent. They have to have.
but they are constantly in motion, aren't they? Sure.
Green. One's over good on green. All right, we're good. So the Earth is constantly revolving around the sun. Okay, so what we call a qualitative determination. It could be an apple. It could be a biological organism. It could any qualitative determination. A planet, a solar system, anything. Ultimately, those are, according to systems theory, they're systems. That's the premise of systems theory. Now, systems theory is kind of like the bourgeoisie's approximation of dialectics. It's not quite there, but it's an approximation. Every given thing, though, is not just a thing. It's a process. It contains an internal process. That's the kernel of truth in systems theory. Every given thing is really just the form of a process. When the process acquires form, the revolution has complete. When revolutions complete, yes, they continue to move, but they don't move in ways that how should I put it? They move with such a degree of consistency, and they move with such a degree of stability and predictability that they become forms. That's where form comes from. You know, when a revolutionary process stabilizes, we no longer see it as in motion. The only things we see in motion are the things that like put it this way. When you see a guy walking around, yeah, he's walking around, but it's the same guy, right? Or when you see a car, its wheels are moving. Actually, you really can't see the wheels are moving if it's going at a sufficient speed. You just see a wheel, right? There's so many other examples of, like, you see something that looks static, like a self-same form, but actually underlying it is a constant perpetuation of a process and a cycle. So I don't think the October Revolution ended in the sense that the motion ended. Even to this day in the Russian Federation, it's still turning off those wheels that began in 1917, for sure. But what happened is the revolution acquired determination. And Trotsky hated that. He thought the revolution should continue to solely be defined negatively, but revolutions are also eventually acquire a positive definition. Just negation, eternal negation is not the same thing as revolution. Trotsky's permanent revolution really means permanent negation.
Well, I think permanent negation is a part of this process of motion, and I'll go to what you're saying here about. That's a nice hat.
But negation has the opposing tension of negation and positive determination, and together they form a qualitative determination. So, even a particle in modern physics, a neutron or a proton or an electron, very much are suspended in negation, but also positive determination. It's a relationality. It's a polarity, right?
Sure. So there's this like constant transformation of the revolution. You would argue, like you say that it's constantly changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you'd argue that it doesn't take on these qualitative leaps that would qualify it as a revolution again, right? Am I getting that right?
A new revolution. Okay, for example, China. China had the revolution in 49, but it also had the Cultural Revolution. But the Cultural Revolution did not overthrow the proletarian dictatorship in the party state. The reason it was a new revolution was because it was happening at a different dimension of society. And yes, there are dimensions of a civilization and society that can continue to be, that can be open to new revolutions. But when a revolution stabilizes, you have a changing of the guard that is continual, that's processual, and which is what? Dynastic. So I would argue the DPRK is a revolutionary state. But the succession, the dynastic succession of leadership is revolutionary change for sure. But we don't think of it as revolution because it doesn't seem like it's new. Just like when we see a wheel turning, it's nothing new. But as such, it is new, right? It's a passing of the baton. It is a change, a generational change, and so on. So I have a kind of dynastic notion of revolutionary succession.
Okay, well, all right. I see where you're coming from. So it's a bit of a differentiation between the initial revolution, which it takes hold, like let's say 1917, and then it goes through cycles, but you wouldn't call those further revolutions. So one thing I do want to stick on is the possibility. Sorry,
they are new revolutions, but they are revolutions that deepen and enrich the forms and qualitative determinations that emerge out of the revolution rather than liquidate them.
Okay. So two things that are part of this I'm curious about. What would you consider the withering away and eventual abolition of the state a revolution? And then how do you think you could have a revolution that sticks to one country that's able to actually achieve socialism without spreading internationally?
Well, the revolution corresponding to the withering of the way of the state, the way I see it is just a continual process of dynastic revolutionary change, like Mao's Cultural Revolution and so on and so on. These cycles, after a certain threshold of cycles, eventually, yes, the state proper that was defined by Engels withers away. Now, does that mean central authority is gone? I don't think so. But
of course not. Yeah, you still have to have a small organizing apparatus.
Yeah, so the deepening of revolutionary cycles. Now, the second question you had was, how can revolutionary cycles continue to deepen without inevitably spreading? And my basic response to this is that I think that it is inevitable that they spread, actually, but they don't spread like a certain nodal center just expanding, and they don't spread in an expansionist way. They spread more in the sense of the creation of a revolutionary center, which is like a center of gravity, which then influences the rest of the world.
Like the Comintern?
No, not even.
Okay.
Our experience of civilization and our reality globally is very much interconnected. What happens in America very much affects the threshold of possibility that is imprinted upon our brains and our minds. And, the Arab Spring, for example, absolutely affected America. So, and the way this happens is it just furthers and extends the threshold of what we consider possible within a civilization. Monkey see, monkey do. We tend to, like a viral TikTok challenge, like the ice bucket challenge or something, right? Like a trend. There's a certain logic of civil society of like trends can spread.
Yes, like if there was a revolution in the U.S., it'd be a role model for the whole world.
Yeah, it would spread like a trend. Trends can spread. That's the point. So there's a logic of civil society at play that's global, for sure. And I think that's inevitable. But what's not it's never guaranteed that the revolution will influence a given country in a way that you expect it to. Stalin didn't anticipate that the revolution would influence China in the way that it did with Mao, for example, right? So that is the way that a revolution spreads, in a revolutionary way, by the way, because I think Mao was more revolutionary than Stalin in many ways, right? And this is what guarantees the openness of the revolutionary process, but there's never a guarantee from any central place of control that it's going to expand within your control. The control aspect isn't there. So yes, revolutions spread, but not within the control of revolutionary actors within a given context.
So you're saying that it doesn't spread by the movements of a revolutionary actor. I mean, wouldn't that be the party? Are you saying it doesn't spread across national lines through
No,
revolutionary
yeah,
actors?
if I'm the revolutionary actor within my nation and I'm participating in the revolutionary process, I can't control how that's going to influence another country. I am not the leader of that country's process. You know, even the Jacobins understood this, by the way. That's why Robespierre was so against expanding the war effort in France. He didn't want to become a war of expansion because he's like, we are the subject, we are participating in our own revolutionary process. For us to extend a degree of control over how that's going to influence other nations means that we're going to be assuming a position with respect to those countries that's not the same as the one we have to our own. So they could anticipate how that would have a corrupting effect on the revolution within. The imperial tendency, so to speak, that we see with Napoleon.
Like this push and pull between a centralized revolutionary supporter and like in one country and the influences of imperialism coming from another one.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite understand that.
No, it's all right. So, for example, if you had a centralized country that is trying to develop revolutions in other countries, you're saying that there would be influences of imperialism onto the country that is trying to spread that revolution?
No, I'm saying that, yeah, well, your country would start to occupy and control other countries in ways that bypass the process of organically acquiring the popular support and being the voice of your own people. You know, like if you're in France and you're the Jacobins, you're an organic son of the soil, you're the voice of the French masses and the French people. Okay, and you said, I want to control how the revolution plays out in Spain. You don't have the same relationship to the Spanish people, though. You didn't do the long work of building a mass organization of the Spanish. You don't speak their language. You don't understand their culture. You don't have the same relationship. So you would be kind of meddling and extraneously imposing your will on a nation who will simply see you as a foreigner, right?
Well, do you think that if there were proletarians in one country that wanted the revolution to spread through a country, but they do not have the Communist Party built up necessary for that yet, that like wouldn't they appeal to that revolutionary country to support them? Even though they are not of that country themselves?
The country would have to judge fairly, are you the actual genuine representative of your nation? Or, like, because the Comintern absolutely funded communists worldwide and gave them the resources they needed to do that, but most of them were not successful. You know, Moscow funded everybody till the end, till 91. But most of the communist parties worldwide did a very lousy job at becoming the leaders of their nation and the voice of their masses. And usually to do that, they actually had to break with Moscow because Moscow imposed a certain orthodox institutional paradigm. So, you really, it's not as though Stalin and the ML states didn't actually help other communists. It's that, for example, if you're the Soviet Union, should you risk it all to prop up an unpopular minority of communists in Germany and prop them up basically to be the heads of state using your own military? Well, that ignores and neglects the protracted and long process of building up actual support and good faith and goodwill among your people. And for this to be imposed, you're seen as a foreign occupier, basically.
I see where you're coming from, but you said at the same time spreading the revolution by invading other countries and by-stepping that process. Is that something that you support? Like, for example, the spread of the Soviet Union by armed force into Eastern European countries through the war? The WAR?
Yeah, it was absolutely a mistake because... Oh, you mean in the Great Patriotic War, not the Civil War?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that was, of course, justified by right of conquest because it was the USSR that was invaded, and those states were used as the launching pad to do it. So it fell within the logical demand of the USSR that those states would not be militarily used against the USSR. I don't think the USSR actually forced or exported its model onto those states. They didn't turn Poland and Hungary and Germany into Soviet republics. They more or less created basic guidelines of, okay, be a nice, good democracy and don't be an aggressive militarist power. Sure, it definitely imposed certain terms and conditions. And, the Soviet occupation created favorable conditions for communists, for sure. But it's a big myth that the Soviets simply appointed the communists in those nations. It's not true. They actually preferred, I think they preferred, actually, that they wouldn't be ruled by communists, as a matter of fact.
Okay. So I want to go back to one of the questions I asked earlier is how do you think socialism is possible? I think we could agree, like Marx said, a system based on abundance in a country, in a single country.
What do you mean?
Like, how can you have socialism in one country?
Because so the relationship of a country to a mode of production is the question, right? And modes of production take national forms. Now, usually a modality of production, when it is inceptual, becomes a dominant tendency in all countries simultaneously because of the logic of civil society itself. So you could have a bunch of feudal countries and capitalism can prevail simply because, the logic of civil society, the disruptive nature of profit mongering by some foreign mercantile power introduces practices and relationships of production that previously did not exist. Monkey see, monkey do, right? And in the case of socialism, a country can actually be advanced to the point of a more qualitatively advanced modality of production while the rest of the world is backward. In the same way that, for example, capitalism can develop maybe in a few city-states and then take over the whole world. And we can see examples of a superior socialist mode of production actually inspiring other nations with the necessity of adopting the modality of production, not only according to the logic of civil society, but according to the logic of politics. So, for example, in order for the USA to fight the Soviet Union, it actually had to adopt a lot of practices that we thought were exclusive to socialist nations. Economic planning, control over supply chains, and so on and so on. And we're seeing something similar with China today. So it is inevitable that socialism will influence the world if it is adopted in one country. But is it possible to build socialism in one country? Yes, it is. But that simultaneously establishes the inevitability that you're going to be influencing the rest of the world if your mode of production is truly more advanced, which history shows it was.
I agree. I mean, I'm not here to say that a centralized economy or a planned economy is a problem. It's absolutely support it. I mean, that's the best thing about the Soviet Union that allowed it to go from a backwards peasant country to a global superpower, right? Is the planned economy. It's what allowed it to win the Great Patriotic WAR, these kinds of things. But I want to hear your definition of socialism on one country. I can tell you mine first, but I've been yapping, so you can go.
Defining socialism.
Yeah, and like how that connects to socialism in one country.
Okay, I would say a socialist mode of production is a mode of production according to the principle of fulfilling the needs and well-being of the overwhelming majority of the population. Off the top of my head, if you put a gun to my head, force me to define socialism, I would say that the production is governed by a logic and is commanded by the principle of fulfilling some kind of common social interest. That's not the only way I would define socialism, but it's like gun to my head, define it in less than 30 seconds. That's how I would do it.
Do you think abundance is a critical element of socialism, or is like an essential element?
No, actually, I don't.
So this is one of my big sticking points with that theory, is that socialism, my definition, is a society where the productive forces are owned or are controlled by the state, and there is a democratically controlled centralized plan that executes production to an extent where society has its needs and wants fulfilled with more than enough to go around of all the necessary products to move society forward. And the reason I emphasize this
So
abundance.
I don't really have time to get into all that. I understand the abundance argument. I'm just gonna say, and we're gonna probably have to wrap it up here. I'm just
Okay.
gonna say that the way I think about modes of production is in terms of modalities, of cycles and systems. Just like when I talk about revolutions, right? So production is always a process that has a cycle, right? A beginning, a middle point, an end, and a reproduction process. And a mode of production, it's almost like a biological organism. It has to reproduce itself, right? In a kind of systemic way, consistently systemic way. And, it's almost kind of like a cybernetic understanding where you have to think about when we're talking about distinct modes of production, we're talking about distinct modalities of like what is almost like a living organism, right? Distinct ways of a given integral division of labor reproducing itself. How does it reproduce itself? And so on and so on. And the capitalist kind of society, it's like an organism. And how does the organism reproduce? Well, the capitalist form of reproduction is where the circuit of capital, MCM prime, right, is the basis and the foundation of economic activity, right? So the continual accumulation of surpluses in the form of money, right, in the form of exchange value, creates this kind of retrocausal, almost autonomous process whereby all manner of economic institutions and relationships and technological innovation proliferates and so on at a huge scale, all because of this kind of underlying logic of this circuit of capital, right? And it's the circuit of capital that prevails as the like governing logos, the governing logic of production. And just from that spark, you get the modern industrial civilization we call capitalism. So I like to think of modes of productions in terms of these kind of like governing and guiding principles or a logic of production, right? That actually pre-exists a given state of society. So I think saying abundant, the premise is abundance, puts the cart before the horse, I think, because that's just this particular state of society. It's not referring directly to the underlying principle of society, so to speak, right? So
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
So I think going off of that, it's like you
we
can have
gotta wrap it up there. I gotta bring more guests. Sorry, man. Don't mean to do it abruptly, but all right.